Today we're going to ask, did God have a wife? Was there a Mrs. God? Well, you wouldn't think so if you've ever read the Bible.
You know, I presented this question to my husband some time ago, about a couple of years ago, and I said, did you know God had a wife? And he goes, well, if you did, so what does that make to me? And I go, well, I thought God was by himself.
But we have multiple textual attestations to Asherah as the consort, the partner, the wife of Adonai, who is the God of the Bible.
Well, Yahweh might have had a consort, or a wife, if you will.
You might have heard that God had a wife, the Goddess Asherah.
I don't see any evidence from Jesus, the New Testament writers, or the Old Testament writers about a divine mother.
Okay.
All right. Do you think such a person exists?
Absolutely, 100%.
Why?
Because I'm a girl, and if God's a guy, where did I come from?
God had a wife?
Oh, Jesus Lord! Did you guys know that God had a wife? Is only about as surprising a statement as the fact that Judaism was polytheistic before the end of Exodus, and saw a resurgence of Canaanite gods and goddesses finding their way into the first temple, whereupon the destruction of said temple and the following Babylonian exiles struck an epitaph on that idea before some hillbilly from Judah stuck a purely philosophical/ideological addendum onto that idea, which ironically regressed the religion back into polytheism, whereupon some hillbilly from Gaza came into town, some old guys had a debate about his divinity, and subsequently the religious successor to Judaism became polytheistic. At least by technicality. This is all in the book if you bothered to read it. I'd be willing to wager that most of you watching this have no idea what the hell I'm talking about. Don't worry, we'll be covering some pretty big boy philosophical topics in today's video with my signature dumbed down and riddled with double entendres and sex jokes presentation style. For those of you who are new here, I am Messiahs of Mythology, no points for guessing the subject matter of my videos, and I like to make double entendres and sex jokes. I know the title of this video presents the subject matter as a character study, but I really wanted to talk about the Axial Age and its impact on the granddaddy to the world's foremost religions, and Asherah seems as good a vehicle as any to get into and drive my point all the way through that playground full of school children. Metaphorically. In Minecraft. Does that even work anymore, or do I have to remind YouTube that jokes exist? Typing the name Asherah into YouTube presents you with a laundry list of videos overly fixated on the supposed shock factor that Zam! She was the wife of God! I consider this to be a real shame because the religion of Yahweh being polytheistic is about as surprising as the twist in the Scarlet Letter. And to simplify and centralize her significance so much is to utterly ignore the fact that this lady is present in a lot of mythologies in and surrounding the Levant. You've got the Canaanite Asherah, the Ugartic Atirat, or Elat, the Hittite Aserdu, the Akkadian Asiratu, the pre-Islamic Arabian Atirat. Hell, there's even a theory that a new kingdom Egyptian goddess was imported by the Hyksos, who, ironically enough, started showing up in texts right after the unified Egyptians had just ejected said Hyksos from their ruling class. Clearly, Asherah has had her finger in more religious pies than I have had my nose in the panties at Victoria's Secret. Though the earth-shattering revelation that Judaism, a religion touted as the originator of monotheism, though that in of itself is a crock of shit, could possibly allow for a foreign invader into their, pantheon? Monotheon? Is just such a ridiculous notion that apparently the internet and its subsequent laymen just can't cope with that revelation. Well, I'll simplify it for you. Nothing in Judaism is wholly original. Even Yahweh, who eventually is going to get his own character study, trust me, is a Canaanite god of old, whose name was conveniently changed to the title we know nowadays, wherein the Bible was revised, poorly I might add, at a much later date to fit in with the modern trend of monotheism. So I guess we'll start there. Why was Asherah, and a multitude of other gods/goddesses of old Judaism, eventually expelled? Well, contrary to the incredibly simple-minded and dullard one-word explanation of sexism touted by those who look no further into this subject than your average American voter looks beyond political labels, the answer is a bit multifaceted. A lot of people like to say that monotheism was established via Yahweh during the time of Exodus, to which I will retort, pay attention to how the first commandment is worded. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. If you're wondering why it is that this commandment's language is structured this way and not, I am the Lord your God, the sole God of humanity, and thou shalt not make reverence to idolatrous and false deities or something like that, it's because the ancient form of Judaism didn't outright reject these other deities, but this commandment was designed to try and sway the people away from their influence and reserve all of their worship for this God. In a word, Judaism at this time was monolatrous, not monotheistic. It makes sense when you read this within context, as the people of Israel, even after having skedaddled out of Egypt under the supervision of Moses, were still creating images towards the adulterous golden calf, stand-in for either Baal or, humorously enough, El. This following the fact that God does a complete 180 with regards to his people sojourning into Egypt in the first place, but I digress. The fact that this indignation occurred relatively quickly after Yahweh rescued his people from the very same problem he caused in the first place means that this commandment was likely penned in an effort to curtail the polytheistic shenanigans he saw as a slight towards himself.
Read, nigga! Read!
Or, much more cynically, the authors of Exodus saw this as a slight towards the sanctity their God was supposed to command. Though it is true that it wasn't until the Jews were allowed to return to Israel wherein idolatry was explicitly banned, as the inclusion of foreign gods into the initial Temple of Solomon was seen as the catalyst by which God had brought down the punishment of allowing the Babylonians to sack their city and destroy their temple in the first place. However, I feel as though I'm getting a bit ahead of myself here, and so I should explain the socio-political circumstances which led to this event. For as long as the Kingdom of Israel existed, there was a symbiotic relationship within the political monarchy and the spiritual priestly class. Though by reading Samuel and Psalms 2 in a more cynical light, we can see that there was a particular distrust which was, at the very least, exclusive to the priestly class, but almost certainly mutual. The bargain, called Beret Olam in 2 Samuel 23:5, translated to Eternal Covenant, saw the monarch guaranteeing a cultic worship of Yahweh in exchange for his divine protection. This covenant began its life under the rule of King David, whereby Jerusalem was established as the capital of his kingdom, extended to his son Solomon, who constructed his first national temple within the city's borders, possibly with the help of a pentagram ring and 72 give or take demons, but that's a video for, like, another 50 years or so down the line. The issue here is that the Bible almost universally concerns itself with matters of religious orthodoxy within the borders of Jerusalem, and outside this narrow scope, there is still large pockets of polytheistic worship. With exception to the aforementioned golden calf, the strongest reverence is apparently held out towards Asherah, as seen in the remains of the Temple of Tel Arad, located about 34.5 miles south of Jerusalem. If you want to know what that is in kilometers, go fuck yourself. This temple has the honor of being the only temple of Judaism, outside of Jerusalem, discovered from this pre-monotheistic era, and was apparently modeled after the much more famous temple built by Solomon, with one major exception. The Holy of Holies, the deepest part of the sanctum believed to be where the influence of God was at its strongest. In the temple at Tel Arad, the Holy of Holies actually has 2 standing stones and subsequently 2 incense altars. Granted, one of them is clearly larger than the other, though regardless, this suggests that at least within this temple, there were at least 2 deities venerated by its priests. The first is suspected to be Yahweh, obviously, though the second is thought to be his consort, the Canaanite Asherah. Of course, these stones aren't labeled with a, "Hello, my name is the real Slim Shady," so this is all speculation. though the presence of a female consort to the God of Israel makes quite a bit of sense, seeing as God, as we know him today, is almost certainly the Canaanite El, and Asherah was already his wife, at least according to the Agartic tablets retelling of Canaanite mythology found in Ras Shamra on the coast of Syria. What's more is the discovery of the Kuntalet Ajrad, a shrine site located in the northern part of the Sinai Peninsula. There, a storage jar depicting a calf sucking his father's penis can be found, and much less importantly, a depiction of two figures walking arm in arm, one clearly wearing some sort of crown while the other has strangely pronounced nipples. Directly above this couple watching the donkey show minus the donkey and human and instead just two cows, we find the inscription, Yahweh and his Asherah. Now, some scholars and YouTubers debate whether or not this jar was particularly talking about Asherah the goddess or Asherah the pole or tree, a sort of religious device mentioned numerous times throughout the Bible. To them, I say go sit on a lowercase Asherah. What the hell is this then? Working in tandem is the physical evidence found in Tel Arad and numerous early sculptures found throughout ancient Israel showcasing a goddess holding up her boobies. I'm gonna go with Occam's razor here and say that Asherah, at least in the satellite regions around Jerusalem, was worshipped alongside Yahweh. However, my cynical ass has to interject here and reiterate once again, I don't think that this is an earth-shattering revelation as some make it out to be. We already know that the learned or scholarly class of priests in Jerusalem were near constantly writing complaints on how various other foreign gods found themselves and their idols sanctified in Solomon's temple, particularly during the reign of King Ahab and his Yoko Ono-esque wife Jezebel. Oh wait, wrong picture. To those of you who haven't read your holy book, which I know isn't many of you, some biblical history. The year is 736 BC, and what we consider today as Israel is divided into two kingdoms, Israel to the north and Judah to the south. Up north, things aren't looking too great. They had just gone through 5 kings in less than 10 years, and so the entire state was basically an anarchist wet dream, where everything was on fire, there was near constant political infighting, there was no agreed upon age of consent, and just outside their borders is the Akkadian Empire imitating a cartoonishly colored hippo looking to swallow up their little white marble. And wouldn't you believe it? They did. In 722 BC, Sargon II sacked the capital city of Samaria, dispelled 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel into their borders, and after their forceful assimilation, they pretty much disappeared from history faster than my dad after he didn't have to pay child support anymore. Minus the historical revisionists who have been yapping on for centuries about the tribe of Dan being the progenitor for early Europeans, simply based on the fact that Dan sounds vaguely similar to Danes. Following this, the kingdom of Judah to the south was starting to sweat bullets, and not for the first time in the anthology which was the Bible, found themselves re-evaluating their stance on the concept of God and how he should be worshipped. Keep in mind that at this point, monolatry, not monotheism, is the rule of thumb. So therefore, all the other Canaanite gods and goddesses whose idols have been included in Yahweh's temple were condemned openly by who we might call the pre-exile prophets, or holy men who claim to have seen the future of Israel/Judah, and it looked about as grim as prospects of anyone under the age of 40 trying to own a piece of property. Beginning with Amos around 760 BC, and then following 7 others whose writings were included into the canon Bible up until 587 BC with Isaiah, these guys repeatedly, and not subtly, called their fellow citizens whores for these foreign gods who would eventually invoke the wrath of Yahweh. This prophesied doom apparently canonized by the fall of the First Temple in Judah and the Babylonian exile which followed it. Needless to say, these prophets' rhetoric started gaining a lot of ground after their writings had been largely ignored and the consequences of their supposed impiety largely felt. However, interestingly enough, this is really the last time that any sort of polytheistic Canaan deities were featured in the mainstream Bible, and instead, a lot of work was done between the exile-era writings, post-exile-era writings, and the reconstruction of the Bible itself to exclusively feature stories and proverbs which explicitly favor a monotheistic worldview of their religion. They didn't do a very good job of it, since the first commandment still includes those 2 extra pesky words, but I digress. So, like all of the other patron gods of the Israelites' neighbors, Asherah was swept out the door with the condemning passages in Exodus and the writings of the pre-exile prophets being included for good measure to make sure that they are kicked out and stayed out. Hence why you're not going to see any Old Testament passages wherein Yahweh consults his wife for her steadfast counsel, or even acknowledge any of the other deities of the old Canaanite pantheon aside from openly chastising his people for venerating them in any way. So I suppose, yes, you could bring up the fact that God had a wife in conversation the next time you play Trivial Pursuit on game night, but like I said, it's not super interesting once you get past the explanation that polytheistic Judaism was basically a one-to-one with a lot of old Canaanite religions. Well, if you made it this far, why not like the video, subscribe if you haven't already, and leave a comment telling me what a putrid, ugly little fuck I am in the comment section for the algorithm. Massive thanks, as always, to my Patreons listed here, as well as our channel members, as that is a thing that people are actually taking advantage of now. You guys are the farm hands which gently massage my cow titties so that I may lactate more content into everyone's mouth. No, you probably won't be getting that mental image out of your head. But until next time, ladies and gentlemen of the internet, my name is Messiahs in Mythology. I hope you all have a God's blessed day and a good yarn.